Imagine lying under a blanket of animal hides, pressed shoulder to shoulder with your entire family, the bitter cold clawing just inches away. Above you, the same stars we see today glitter over a world raw and wild. Every night was a gamble between warmth and the waiting darkness. What did our ancient ancestors do to survive these brutal nights? And how did their fight against the cold shape the very idea of family? Let's slip back thousands of years and uncover their hidden world. It's hard to truly grasp the kind of cold that pressed itself into the bones of early humans. We imagine winter as something that comes with wool coats and cozy firesides, with steaming mugs cradled in gloved hands. But thousands of years ago, there were no walls to stop the wind, no roofs to block the endless drift of snow. The world was open and merciless, and the night arrived like a vast black sea, rolling over fragile clusters of people who clung to each other for more than comfort, for survival. Picture it, a raw landscape stretching beyond any horizon, the sky a heavy lid of iron-gray clouds. The sun would dip early, chased away by the season, and with its retreat, the air would sharpen into a blade. There were no paved paths, no lanterns glowing at a neighbor's window, just the silent sweep of the land, dotted here and there by scraggly trees or rocky outcrops that offered meager shelter. In the midst of that, small gatherings of humans huddled near crackling fires, which hissed and spat as if offended by the cold themselves. The fire was everything. Its dance was the only light against the oppressive dark, its warmth the only shield against the creeping chill that seemed to have a will of its own. People would crowd around it, shoulders pressed tight, hands splayed out, faces turned toward the flames as though in worship. And in a way, it was a kind of worship, an unspoken agreement that if they fed the fire, it might spare them from the worst the night could bring. But the flames were hungry, and wood was not always plentiful. It had to be gathered during the scant hours of daylight, hauled back from wherever fallen branches or dried scrub could be found. Even then, the fire might sputter and fade long before dawn. When that happened, the darkness felt alive, thick, with unseen eyes. Creatures of the night prowled just beyond the circle of dim orange glow. Sharp ears twitched at every crack of twigs under heavy paws, every soft snort of breath. Humans knew that beyond the reach of the fire waited predators who felt no cold the way they did. Powerful jaws and patient hunger could just as easily be the end of them as the chill itself. There was a different kind of silence to these nights, not the peaceful hush of fresh snow in a modern yard, but a tense stillness. It was a quiet that listened back, that seemed to hold its breath. Mothers clutched their little ones closer, drawing them under furs still rank with the scent of the animals they once belonged to. Old men tightened their cloaks, their eyes darting constantly toward the tree line or the mouth of a cave, wherever they had chosen to make camp. Even the strongest hunters knew that sleep was a dangerous luxury. Dozing too deeply might mean not waking up at all, lost either to the gnawing cold or to teeth in the night. The body is a fragile vessel in such relentless elements. Fingers and toes turned stiff first, losing feeling before pain could properly warn them of damage. Noses, ears, lips, small extremities betrayed by their distance from the heart's steady drum. Even a healthy adult could find themselves in peril after only a few hours without shelter. A simple mistake, like sleeping too far from the fading coals, could have grim consequences by morning. The cold didn't need to be sudden or violent. It simply waited, patient, creeping through layers of skin, slowing the blood, whispering lullabies of numbness that could tempt the tired into permanent stillness. And so, people learned, generation by generation, to fear the night's icy grasp. Stories were told around those precious fires, tales of wandering figures found curled on the ground at dawn, their faces peaceful, their breath long since gone. Tales of figures spotted at the forest's edge, moving oddly, who were said to be spirits of those who had lain down in the cold and never risen. Such warnings weren't just for children. They were the folklore of survival, reminders carved into memory as sharply as any tool. Every dusk brought a quiet scramble to secure warmth. Parents layered extra hides over their sleeping places, not out of luxury, but necessity. Watchers were chosen to stay alert with spears in hand, poking at the embers when they threatened to die out. And always there was the press of bodies together, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, sharing every breath of heat. Privacy didn't exist in these moments. Modesty was a foreign concept when life depended on skin against skin, heartbeat against heartbeat. Above them stretched the sky, vast and indifferent. The stars might glitter like ice chips, dazzling in their distant splendor, but offered no mercy. If anything, their brightness seemed to mock the frailty below, cold fires that could not be touched or harnessed. And yet still, people lifted their gazes, perhaps drawing some small comfort from the constancy of that dome of light. It was something to measure time by, something to whisper prayers to, even if it never answered. This was the relentless stage upon which humanity first learned the value of warmth, not just for comfort, but for the very act of staying alive. Each evening was a test. Each morning was a triumph. And somewhere in those long, shivering hours lay the seeds of every clever invention to come, all born from the desperate need to cheat the chill that waited, ever patient, just beyond the ring of firelight. Even with a fire blazing at the heart of their little encampment, ancient people quickly discovered that it was never quite enough. The flames danced beautifully, crackled with promise, cast their orange glow on faces lined with tension or fatigue, but the comfort they offered was shallow and deceitfully fragile. A single step back from the circle of warmth, and the cold rushed in like water into a breached boat, soaking through skins and flesh with startling speed. Fire was a marvel, no question. It had changed everything, lifting early humans out of a state of raw vulnerability and giving them a chance to stand their ground against the dark. But it was also a fickle ally. Its reach was pitifully small. Move too far from it, even by a stride or two, and the night reclaimed you. The freezing air seemed to claw at any bit of warmth that strayed beyond the immediate clutch of flames. Then there was the simple, stubborn reality of how bodies worked. A person sitting right next to the blaze might feel hot on the side facing the fire, while the side turned away from it still shivered violently. Heat didn't wrap itself evenly around them. It lashed out in licks and flickers, leaving backs exposed and vulnerable. People would constantly twist and turn, trying to roast one side at a time, like slow-cooking meat on a spit. This awkward dance was necessary just to keep from feeling pain in their own skin, because warmth wasn't a gentle comfort here. It was a rotating privilege. Worse yet, fires were living, hungry things. They demanded constant attention, constant feeding. Dry wood had to be found, hauled in bundles that scraped raw shoulders, then carefully arranged to avoid smothering the delicate breath of the flames. If no one stayed awake to tend it, the fire could dwindle to glowing ghosts under a layer of gray ash, offering no more protection than a memory. In those moments, panic often broke out. Hands digging frantically through embers, blowing on coals with desperate urgency, hoping to coax a tiny tongue of flame back into life before the cold fully descended. Even a strong fire couldn't stop the night from pressing in. Heat simply bled upward and outward, lost into the vast emptiness above. The earth beneath was often frozen hard as stone, leaching warmth from feet and legs without mercy. If someone sat too long without shifting, the ground would seem to swallow their heat, replacing it with a biting numbness that crawled up their body. There was also the matter of sleep. People couldn't remain perched upright by the flames all night without surrendering to exhaustion. When they finally lay down, wrapping themselves in stiff hides, many drifted only a pace or two away from the fire. In dreams, they might roll farther still, unconsciously seeking more space or a softer patch of ground. And just like that, the cold would pounce. Stories passed down from elders warned of those who never woke again, found curled in the morning light with frozen lashes and lips, having simply wandered too far from the fragile circle of heat. Sometimes it was more prudent, though deeply unsettling, to let the fire burn down on purpose. A roaring blaze could catch the eye of predators lurking in the dark. Wolves, massive cats, or even prowling two-legged raiders saw firelight as a beacon, a sign that people were gathered there, distracted by comfort, perhaps weak or low on weapons. So bands of early humans often faced a grim choice: keep the flames high and risk drawing unwanted company, or let it die low and risk the creeping cold swallowing them one by one. All of this meant that fire, as miraculous as it was, offered only partial security. It was a fragile thread stretched thin between survival and peril, snapping all too easily with a missed log or a careless nod into sleep. In the end, they needed more than flickering flames. They would have to learn how to bring the heat closer, to hold it against their own beating hearts, to invent ways of sharing and trapping warmth that went beyond simply sitting by a pile of burning sticks. And so, almost by instinct, humans began to explore other means of chasing the cold from their fragile bodies, means that would change the shape of their nights forever. It's almost poetic to think that long before blankets, mattresses, or even the simplest woven fabrics, the first true bedding humanity ever knew was the very skin of the beasts they hunted. In a world stripped of modern comforts, where a hard patch of dirt or rough stone was the only available floor, animal hides were more than just trophies, they were salvation. Early humans quickly discovered that draping a fresh hide over their shoulders helped beat back the cold in ways that mere layers of grass or twigs never could. But it didn't stop there. As the nights grew crueler and frost began to creep across the ground like a silent tide, they learned to spread these skins beneath them and over them as makeshift nests. It wasn't simply about covering their bodies. It was about creating a barrier, a vital, insulating layer that blocked the relentless theft of heat by earth and air alike. Imagine a small band of people after a long, grueling day of hunting. Their breath streamed in pale clouds around their faces as they dropped down beside the campfire, muscles aching from pursuit and the heavy haul of carcasses. With practiced motions, they rolled out the treated hides, some still bearing faint ghost stains of old blood, others darkened by smoke and countless nights of use. These were not clean by any modern sense, not soft or delicately scented. They were rugged, often coarse, carrying the deep musk of the animals they once belonged to. But that was part of their power. The thick, greasy pelts of deer, elk, bison, and sometimes predators like wolves or bears offered unmatched insulation. Hair and fat trapped precious body heat, creating a microclimate against the skin that could mean the difference between a night of miserable shivering and the oblivion of sleep. When laid atop rough soil or cold rock, the hides stopped the bitter ground from drinking away a person's warmth. Draped over shoulders, they held in the body's own fragile furnace, bundling it close like a secret. Over time, people learned to choose specific hides for specific purposes. The lighter, more supple skins of young animals might be saved to wrap infants or to serve as inner linings. Heavier, thicker pelts were reserved for the brutal depths of winter when nothing else sufficed. Some families even had prized furs handed down season after season, treated and smoked until they lost any lingering rot and instead took on the dark, sweet tang of wood and ash. In the quiet dark, small hands would clutch these furs close, pressing their faces into the dense guard hairs. There was a comfort there that went beyond simple warmth. It was the lingering presence of life, of something that once ran across these same frozen plains, something that knew how to withstand the cold on its own terms. In wrapping themselves in animal skins, humans weren't just protecting their bodies. They were, in a strange way, borrowing the resilience of the creatures they had hunted. These early beds were rarely solitary. Space was precious, and so was heat. People would lie close together on a patchwork of hides, pulling others over their bodies until the group was buried under a mound of mingled fur and breathing forms. At night, the soft rustle of shifting limbs and the low murmur of voices blended with the hiss of wind outside. Even with the fire fading, the little nest of humanity continued to generate its own heat, each person a living coal, contributing to a shared glow under the protective weight of skins. Thus, animal hides became more than simple trophies or clothing. They were the first true bedding, not elegant but fiercely effective. They transformed any patch of ground into a crude but vital sanctuary. In this way, the dead sustained the living, offering their warmth long after their hearts had stilled. It was an arrangement born of necessity, but carried out with almost reverent care. For every early human understood on an instinctive level. Without these blankets of fur and hide, the cold would reclaim them by morning, one by one. But even the thickest animal skins couldn't fully spare people from the chill that radiated up from the ground. The earth was an unfeeling thief, always ready to siphon away precious body heat through whatever lay between it and a sleeping human. Over countless cold seasons, early people began to notice that simply lying on a pelt wasn't enough. They needed something more, a cushion, a barrier that would lift them ever so slightly away from the grasp of frost and damp. So they turned to what the land offered in quiet abundance. Dry grasses, soft moss, brittle ferns, and even shredded bark. Before the notion of weaving or stuffing cloth sacks ever crossed a human mind, these humble plants became the first true mattresses and pillows. Gathered during the warmer months when they were plentiful and dry, these materials were carried back to camp in great armfuls. Imagine the scene as the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened. Children, giggling or half drowsy with hunger, would help spread out bunches of grass in rough ovals. Older hands arranged the piles with more care, shaking them out to loosen clumps and make them fluffier. Then a skin was thrown over the top, turning the bed of prickly stalks into something surprisingly comfortable. It was far from the softness we now take for granted, but after long days of chasing prey or trudging through snowdrifts, even a slight lift from the cold dirt felt like a marvel. Moss was especially prized. Its dense, spongy texture offered a gentle give beneath elbows and hips, protecting bones from bruises. It also had a faint, clean scent that lingered in hair and clothing, a living perfume that cut through the ever-present smells of smoke, sweat, and unwashed skin. When people found patches of lush moss growing under the shelter of trees or on north-facing stones, they harvested it carefully, rolling it into loose balls that could be tucked under necks or hips at night. Some families took pride in building up thicker bedding, layering grass and moss until they had a proper mound to rest upon. In time, these makeshift beds became personal spaces of a sort, recognizable by the way the ground was hollowed in the shape of the sleeper, with bits of broken stalks and scattered hair woven invisibly into the mix. Underneath all these efforts lay a simple, urgent truth. Staying off the bare ground meant staying alive. The earth in winter wasn't merely uncomfortable. It could sap the heat from a body so stealthily that people sometimes slipped into a cold daze without even realizing it. They would lie there thinking themselves merely tired, only to awaken hours later, if they awakened at all, with limbs too numb to move. By lifting themselves even a hand's breadth above the soil, by layering grass or moss beneath their hides, they cheated this silent enemy. And there was something deeply human in the way they shaped these first bedding places. They didn't just throw down a heap and collapse. Even in the harshest times, there was a small instinct to smooth the moss with a palm, to fluff the grass a bit under the neck, a kind of primitive tenderness, as if preparing not just to sleep, but to dream. It hints that comfort, no matter how slight or crude, was always more than a luxury. It was a quiet statement of life's stubborn refusal to surrender to the cold, a fragile promise that tomorrow might still come. So in the hush that fell each night, with the fire dying to faint coals and the sky wheeling above in icy brilliance, people laid their heads on beds of grass and moss. They drew their hides close and curled into these little nests they'd made with their own hands. And there, cushioned just enough against the unforgiving ground, they let the long hours of dark pass over them, trusting that these small, simple inventions would carry them safely to the first gray stirrings of dawn. If there was one lesson the bitter cold taught over and over, it was that a solitary body stood little chance against it. Heat leaked from skin as easily as water slipped through cupped hands. No matter how many hides a person wrapped around themselves, or how thick the bed of moss beneath them, they were still just a fragile spark of warmth floating in a vast sea of night air. But gather many sparks together, press them close until shoulder met shoulder, hip met hip, and something miraculous happened. Together, people made a blaze that no frost could so easily smother. This instinct to cluster was older than language. It lived in the very marrow of early humans, echoing from distant ancestors who huddled in burrows or under low trees, pressed tight not only for comfort, but for life. In the raw hush of the ancient world, groups did not simply sleep near each other, they slept tangled together. Adults lay with their sides flush, children tucked between them like small bundles of fire. Sometimes it was awkward, legs thrown over legs, elbows digging into ribs, but it worked. Shared body heat created a living barrier against the cold, a pool of warmth that grew stronger with every person who joined it. By sleeping this way, they weren't just protecting themselves from the chill of air or ground, they were building a breathing, shifting shield against the night's countless threats. In the dark, predators prowled on silent feet, ears twitching at every sound. A lone sleeper, separated even by a few steps from the group, stood out as easy prey. The rhythm of a single breath, the scent of solitary flesh inviting investigation. But a tight cluster of bodies, all layered with hides and exhaling heat together, presented a larger, more confusing target. Movement within the pile often startled prowlers away. The indistinct mass suggested something formidable, not worth the risk. More than that, there was an unspoken safety in knowing someone else's heartbeat thumped close by. When a person awoke in the small hours, half dreaming, they might press a hand out and feel the slow rise and fall of another chest. That gentle rhythm reassured them more deeply than any fire could. It said, "You are not alone. If danger comes, it will face all of us." Such nights forged powerful bonds. A cold night was no respecter of personal distance or quiet customs. In the tangle of sleep, people sometimes found themselves half atop each other, arms or legs entwined, faces so close they breathed the same warm air. Trust had to run deep. The scent of another person's skin, the rasp of their breath, the small shifting movements as they turned or sighed in sleep, all these became familiar, even precious. This closeness bred understanding beyond words, a sense that the survival of each depended utterly on the others. Even disputes and simmering resentments were often eased by these long nights. In daylight, someone might harbor quiet anger over a slight, a harsh word, a broken tool. But when dusk came and the temperature dropped, grudges bent beneath the heavier need to live. They lay down together, all the same, drew the same hide across their shoulders, breathed out the same shared cloud of warmth. And in the dark, the sharp edges of quarrels dulled, replaced by a silent agreement that tomorrow's life mattered more. These clustered sleepings also taught children their earliest lessons about community. A small child might curl first against a mother or father, but soon find themselves pressed on all sides by others, a cousin's foot, an elder's heavy arm. They learned by touch and breath that the world was larger than their own small needs, that survival was a woven thing, stronger together than pulled apart. It was perhaps the first quiet education in what it meant to be human, long before stories were taught or skills were taught. So under the wheeling stars, wrapped in layers of animal hide, nestled on beds of moss and grass, humans formed living fortresses against the cold. Their joined bodies made the night less fearsome, their collective warmth a silent declaration that they would see another dawn. And though none of them could have explained it in words, they each knew by instinct that in this shared heap of fragile, shivering life, they had discovered one of nature's oldest, simplest, and most unbreakable secrets. Together, they could endure what alone would surely overwhelm them. At some point in that vast stretch of prehistory, when the earth was still raw and the nights were a constant test of nerve and endurance, people discovered they weren't the only creatures seeking refuge from the cold. Around the edges of their camps, pairs of glowing eyes sometimes watched from the darkness, not always with hunger, but with a cautious curiosity. These were wolves, drawn by the scent of scraps thrown aside after hunts, by the drift of cooked meat on the breeze, by the very heartbeat of human life. At first, such nearness was fraught with tension. Wolves were powerful, cunning, and perfectly capable of seizing a stray child or gnawing a limb if they were bold enough. But over many seasons, something subtle shifted. Not all wolves lunged or growled. Some lingered at the margins, thin bodies pressed low to the ground, ears back, eyes wary yet hopeful. They learned to keep just enough distance to avoid a thrown spear, but close enough to catch discarded bones and gristle. And humans, ever observant, began to notice a strange possibility. These creatures with sharp teeth and watchful eyes weren't just predators. they were also warm. Even from a few paces off, you could see the steam rise from their bodies on icy nights, smell the musky tang of their fur, sense the potent heat trapped under thick coats that seemed tailor-made to defy winter's bite. It was perhaps inevitable that one night, emboldened by hunger and scent, a lean young wolf crept close enough to snatch a bone right beside the ring of sleepers, and when no spear came, curled up just outside the glow of the fire, nose tucked under tail. The humans watched, knives close at hand. Yet nothing happened. The wolf simply settled there, shivering slightly, eyes slitting shut as though surrendering to a desperate exhaustion. From that fragile moment, a fragile trust took root. As winters came and went, these tentative visitors edged ever closer. In some groups, people began to toss scraps deliberately, rewarding the quieter, calmer wolves who didn't snap or snarl. Nights passed with these wild shapes sprawled a cautious arm's length from where families slept. And gradually, without ceremony, the line blurred. Wolves learned the peculiar warmth of humans was nothing to fear. And humans realized that these breathing lumps of fur were not only scavengers, but living embers. On the harshest nights, the draw of shared heat overpowered every instinctual wariness. A wolf might press against the outside of a hide, soaking up the warmth leaking through. In time, children, half asleep and too young to remember sharper warnings, would reach out small hands to bury fingers in thick ruffs of fur. Some families awoke to find these animals curled right against them, ribs rising and falling in deep, contented breaths, noses twitching at human hair. The benefits were immediate and mutual. Wolves brought a deeper animal heat that humans couldn't replicate. Their bodies ran hotter, their pelts denser. Nestled together, the cluster of people and half-wild canines formed a formidable bulwark against the creeping freeze. In return, the wolves gained consistent scraps, safety from larger predators, and a kind of belonging they couldn't find in harsher wild packs. It wasn't trust as we know it today. There were still growls in the dark, still moments when yellow eyes narrowed and teeth flashed. A wrong move could earn a quick nip. A startled yelp might send the entire pile scattering. But by degrees, through countless long nights, this uneasy alliance became something sturdier. From these rough beginnings would grow the entire story of dogs. But in these earliest chapters, there were no collars or commands. There was simply the shared need not to freeze, a pragmatic partnership forged in the brittle hours before dawn. Humans accepted these creatures into their sleeping circles because their own survival whispered that it was worth the risk. And the proto-dogs, driven by the same desperate calculus, tucked themselves under the edges of hides and breathed out steaming sighs into the human press, discovering that warmth, once shared, was a powerful thing that bound species together long before any words like loyalty or affection were ever spoken. It seemed an obvious solution at first glance: retreat into the yawning mouths of caves. To early humans, battered by icy winds that howled mercilessly across open plains, a cave must have looked like a gift from the earth itself, a ready-made fortress against the elements. Its walls were thick, unyielding stone that no prowling beast could easily claw through, and certainly no gust of winter air could penetrate. Stepping inside offered an immediate relief from the biting, skin-cracking gusts outside. The wind fell away, reduced to a distant moan at the cave's mouth. The echo of footsteps or low voices replaced the endless hissing of the frozen world beyond. It gave a profound illusion of safety, a sense that here, finally was a place to draw breath without fear of being torn apart by claws or pierced by the icy daggers of a storm. But for all the security caves promised, they came with a paradox that early people learned through long, shivering nights. The very stone that shielded them from predators and wind also stole warmth without mercy. Caves were cold in a deep, settled way. Their floors and walls seemed to drink heat from any living thing that touched them. Unlike the ever-moving air outside, the stone held its chill like a secret, heavy and patient. This created an eerie reality. It was often colder inside the cave than just outside its threshold. In open air, sunlight might at least brush skin with fleeting warmth during the day, and fires could radiate their heat freely in all directions. Inside a cave, however, the heat from flames and bodies had nowhere to go but up and into the merciless stone. The lack of breeze meant the cold simply pooled there, thick and unmoving, like water settling in the deepest part of a hollow. In fact, the very absence of drafts, the same quality that made caves seem so secure, was part of the problem. Air inside grew heavy and stagnant, trapping moisture from breath and sweat. This dampness clung to hides and hair, settled into the moss beds people carefully prepared, and made the chill even more insidious. Where wind at least whisked moisture away outside, in a cave it collected, making everything clammy and slow to dry. A fire inside might sputter from this humidity, or struggle to draw properly without enough fresh air feeding it. There was another, subtler hazard. In a cramped cave, smoke could build up quickly. With no steady current to carry it out, it lingered, hanging low, stinging eyes and clogging throats. People sometimes chose the discomfort of more open camps just to avoid coughing through the long hours of night, or waking to find children gasping in the smothering gloom. Yet despite these drawbacks, caves continued to lure them in, season after season. Because cold was only one kind of danger. The world outside teemed with watchful eyes, claws scraping against rock, predators clever enough to circle close in the dark. A deep cave could serve as a refuge where these threats hesitated to follow. By posting guards at the entrance or blocking it with piled stones and bristling spears, humans could create a perimeter that gave them precious moments to wake and react if anything approached. So they accepted the cold, layering furs thicker, piling grasses higher beneath their sleeping bodies, pressing even closer together in their makeshift nests. Fires were built small and carefully managed to avoid filling the space with choking fumes. Some caves still bear the black smears of these ancient hearths, silent witnesses to nights spent half asleep, curled in damp darkness, hearts thudding with the hope that morning would find them still alive. It was a trade-off in every sense. The cave stole warmth, but offered walls strong enough to turn aside the teeth of hunting cats or the prying hands of rival bands. And in a world where danger wore so many faces, that cold, unyielding embrace of stone sometimes felt like the safest shelter of all, even if it meant shivering through endless hours until the sun returned to call them back into the light. It was one of those quiet, ingenious breakthroughs that didn't arrive all at once, but grew out of countless nights spent watching flames die and feeling the brutal cold creep in. Early humans, with their keen eyes always on the dance of the fire, noticed that even after the brightest blaze collapsed into a bed of smoldering coals, there remained a powerful, lingering heat. Stones near the edge of the fire pit would glow faintly, radiating warmth long after the last tongues of flame vanished into ash. So they began to experiment. At first, Perhaps it was nothing more than an instinctive reach, a hand placed over a warmed rock, then pulling away in surprise at how it burned, even in the empty dark. But soon it became a deliberate ritual, lifting these stones, cradling them in scraps of hide or with careful bundles of grass to keep from scorching skin, then carrying them to the places where people slept. Some families scraped shallow hollows in the earth where they would drop glowing pebbles or chunks of charcoal, then carefully mound soil or sand over them to create a gentle, hidden heat source. Hides were thrown on top, followed by bodies seeking relief from the icy clutch of the ground. It was risky. Too thin a layer of earth or too eager a hand, and burns were inevitable. But the promise of a warm bed outweighed the dangers. Others took to laying heated stones under thick layers of moss or dry leaves beneath their sleeping spots. Through the long hours of the night, the stones slowly released their captured warmth, turning a bitterly cold nest into something almost tender. The trick lay in choosing the right rocks, dense ones that held heat but didn't fracture and spit apart when exposed to the intense temperatures of the fire. Over time, they learned through painful trial which stones cracked dangerously and which served faithfully night after night. Ash, too, became an unexpected ally. Once a fire burned down completely, the soft, gray powder it left behind was still warm, even hours later. Some camps discovered that spreading this ash under their bedding, or even lightly over sleeping hides, created a subtle layer of insulation. It was messy. It clung to hair and skin, but it formed a barrier that dulled the sharp bite of frost from below. Imagine a small child pressing close to a parent, both wrapped in stiff, smoky hides, with a nest of ash and heated stones beneath them. The ground there didn't rob them of warmth as cruelly. Instead, it gave back just a little, enough to allow tired muscles to relax and breathing to even out into sleep. There was also a kind of eerie beauty to these practices. In some camps, you might see tiny spirals of steam rising from freshly buried stones, or catch the faint glow of embers through cracks in the dirt. A bed might look ordinary at first glance, a jumble of furs and dry plants, but slip a hand beneath and you'd feel that quiet, persistent heat, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. In this way, early humans turned the very elements against each other. Fire to conquer the cold, stone to capture the fire, earth to cradle the stone. It was a chain of cleverness born not from luxury, but from the raw need to survive another night. Each innovation layered on the last, until what started as mere desperation grew into a small mastery of their harsh world. By warming their beds with rocks and ash, they stretched the life of every fire. They carried its blessing beyond the circle of its light, bringing a measure of its power directly beneath their sleeping bodies. In the heart of winter, that could mean the difference between waking stiff but alive or failing to wake at all. So night after night, stones were heated, ash was carefully sifted, shallow pits were dug with calloused hands. And as families settled into these crude, warm nests, the cold outside the camp seemed just a little less endless, held at bay by quiet embers, clever hands, and the stubborn will to live until morning. Over time, as each brutal season drove home just how relentless the cold could be, early humans pushed their experiments with heat even further. It wasn't enough to simply bring warmed stones into their beds or scatter a little ash beneath a hide. The cold seemed always to find a way back in, warming through every layer, searching for skin to steal warmth from. And so, by a kind of desperate brilliance, they discovered methods even bolder, ways of turning the very ground into a hidden hearth. One such method was as stark and simple as it was risky. They slept directly on beds of warm ash. After a fire had burned down to nothing but a soft, gray field flecked with glowing motes, they would spread out the embers, stirring them carefully so that no bright coals lay too near the surface. A thin skin of dirt or sand might be raked across it to dull the hottest points. Then, atop this, they layered grasses, moss, or spare hides. When they lay down, the heat rose up from beneath them, wrapping their bodies in a gentle warmth that no mere fur on frozen ground could match. It left them dirty, their backs and limbs dusted with fine soot, hair tangled with gritty streaks of ash. But in a world where comfort was measured not by cleanliness but by survival, this was a small price. Many families even welcomed the smell of smoke and char that clung to them. It masked human scent and seemed to discourage insects or prowling beasts that might otherwise have picked up their trail. Some groups took the idea further still, digging deliberate pits that served as long-lasting underground heaters. These were more than shallow hollows scraped by hurried hands. They were carefully carved troughs, sometimes lined with stones to help hold heat even longer. Fires were built directly inside these pits, fed until the stones and surrounding soil grew hot. Then the flames were allowed to die, the embers raked down to an even layer, and a thick blanket of earth piled over the top. On this mound, people spread their bedding of hides and moss, trusting that the slow release of buried warmth would cradle them through the deepest watches of the night. Lying on such a mound, a person could feel a curious, almost eerie heat seeping up into their bones. The cold of the air above remained, brushing cheeks and exposed hands with icy fingers, but their bodies were held by a steady radiance rising from below. It was as if they were sleeping on the breath of some vast creature, slumbering beneath the ground, exhaling waves of secret warmth. Of course, these methods demanded care and knowledge. If the ash beneath was not cool enough, it could smolder into painful burns. If the covering layer was too thin, an ember might flare up in the middle of the night, sending sparks into dried grass or hides. More than one camp surely learned these lessons the hard way, waking to choking smoke or sudden flashes of painful heat. Yet the practice persisted, refined through trial, until families knew by touch how hot was too hot, how deep to bury the coals, how thick to layer the bedding. There was a kind of primitive artistry in it, a dance with elements that could just as easily harm as heal. Watching an elder test the ash with bare hands, spreading fingers to gauge the heat, was like seeing a quiet ceremony, a communion with fire and earth that balanced danger against the sheer necessity of staying alive. In these beds of ash and over these hidden embers, people found a way to cheat the worst of winter's grasp. The soot that clung to their skin in the morning was a mark of victory, a dark, dusty proof that once again they had outwitted the cold. So when dawn finally broke, painting the mouths of caves and tented hides in pale gold, they rose from their gray-dusted nests, tired but not frozen, their bodies warm enough to greet another day. And that was a triumph that needed no words. As the last flames shrank into sullen, red-veined lumps of coal, and the hush of the world deepened to the peculiar, expectant silence that only comes before sleep, small gatherings of people would turn to each other with a language older than words. In these moments before surrendering to the vulnerability of unconsciousness, Early humans performed quiet rituals, small gestures, sounds, and watchful customs that helped them face the long uncertainty of the night. It might begin with the simplest of exchanges, a hand placed gently on another's shoulder, a palm brushed along a child's cheek, the brief locking of eyes that seemed to whisper, "We are still here. We are still together." In the glow of embers, faces were shadows and glints of light, more easily read by the slow blink of eyelids or the tilt of a chin than by any spoken phrase. Fear sat close by every evening. Even the boldest hunters felt its cold fingers stroke along their spines once the world slipped into darkness. Night was the time of dangers they could not see, creatures that prowled beyond the edges of hearing, spirits that perhaps wandered between the trees, silent and watching. And so these quiet rituals became ways of building invisible walls against all that lay outside their fragile circle. They would murmur low sounds, soft hums or clicks of the tongue, or short rhythmic exhalations. These noises were not exactly songs, not yet, but they carried a cadence that soothed. It was as if by layering sound over the silence, they could weave a net to catch whatever dark things might be creeping closer. In some bands, people traced small signs in the air, finger patterns passed down from older kin whose own elders once swore such motions confused or warded off the shadowy forces of night. Mothers often tapped gentle rhythms on their children's backs, an instinctual percussion that settled small hearts and slowed frightened breathing. Lovers or close companions might rest their foreheads together, sharing warmth not only of skin but of breath, until their pulse found the same slow tempo. These were the oldest lullabies, performed body to body, before language carried the power to reassure. There were also shared stories, though calling them stories might be too grand. They were more like murmured fragments, half-formed pictures shaped by hand gestures and quiet vocal bursts. Someone would mimic the sway of trees in the wind, or the stealthy prowl of a hunting cat, then show with a sudden start how it had been driven off. Others would watch, nod, sometimes add their own flourishes. These tiny performances weren't merely entertainment. They were living reminders that dangers could be faced and survived, and that courage, however small, was something to be celebrated. Superstitions threaded through these moments. Some families spat lightly into the fire before lying down, believing it would prevent nightmares. Others drummed softly on hollowed logs or stones, certain the vibrations chased malicious spirits away. Certain gestures, a twist of the wrist, a tapping of the chest, were repeated by nearly everyone without fully knowing why, only that the gesture felt necessary, inherited from countless nights when it might have been the only defense they knew. When finally the cluster of bodies began to settle, voices dropped to faint sighs, and stray hands reached out to confirm the nearness of loved ones. A person might tug gently at another's ankle, or curl a hand into the thick fur of a companion animal, seeking that last confirmation that they were not alone. Above them, the darkness pressed close, heavy with cold and secrets. But inside their tight circle, wrapped in skins, lying atop ash-warmed beds, a delicate sense of trust bloomed, that these small rites performed together could hold the dangers at bay until dawn returned. So sleep would come, not all at once, but in waves, first in one, then another, until the breathing around the circle slowed and deepened into the slow tide of dreams. And if eyes cracked open again in the middle hours, they would find faint outlines of familiar shapes, hear soft sighs, or the rustle of someone shifting in sleep, and drift back under with the comfort that, whatever waited in the dark, they would face it together when morning broke. Even nestled within a huddle of bodies, wrapped in furs and surrounded by the dim assurance of a dying fire, early humans never entirely shed their vigilance. Sleep was a necessity, yet it was also a surrender. The one act that stripped them of their hard-won alertness, left them exposed to dangers that didn't sleep at all. This was a truth that weighed especially heavy on the hunters, whose senses were finely tuned to the presence of threat, and who understood better than anyone the razor-thin line separating safety from calamity. So they slept with weapons in hand, not because they expected to wake each night to a fight, but because the possibility forever loomed at the edges of the dark. It was a habit born of countless close calls, stories whispered in the prelude to sleep about companions who had woken too late to the crunch of paw on stone, or the guttural breath of something large and hungry standing just beyond reach. Imagine lying down, heart finally easing into slower beats, when a distant crack snaps through the stillness, a branch breaking under weight, the subtle scrape of claws on rock. In such a moment, every drop of blood surged through the body, drowning out the quiet hush of sleep. Having a spear or sharpened stick already clutched against the chest meant precious seconds saved. No frantic groping in the dark, no awkward scramble that might give an intruder the chance it needed. The hunter's hand simply tightened, muscles already coiled, eyes snapping open to scan the gloom for the faintest shift in shadow. But beyond pure practicality, sleeping with a weapon was also a salve for the mind. Fear is clever. It breeds illusions that can unravel resolve. Holding on to a spear offered a kind of fragile courage. The shaft of wood under one's fingers was more than just a tool. It was a promise, a silent assurance that if danger came slinking out of the darkness, the hunter would not meet it empty-handed. That thought alone helped calm the wild gallop of the heart enough to let sleep return. There was another layer, deeper and more human still. Among the gathered sleepers, it was often understood without words that the hunter, or whichever member of the group was strongest or most skilled, would be the one lying closest to the mouth of the shelter. Positioned between family and the unknown, they slept lightly, with weapon held loosely yet familiarly, like an extension of their own wary spirit. Even in dreams, their minds ran with the tension of possible pursuit, every rustle of wind or sigh of settling earth threatening to drag them back to full alertness. In this arrangement, everyone played a part. Those in the center clutched each other, trusting the barrier of bodies around them, while those at the edges held their weapons and kept one ear tilted perpetually toward the outer dark. And when dawn finally bled across the sky, chasing shadows from their hiding places, the spear or club would still be there, gripped in a hand stiff with cold, but steady with purpose. So they slept, if it could truly be called sleep, with their minds never fully loosed from the fear that somewhere out in the vast, indifferent night, jaws waited. And by clutching those sharpened lengths of wood and stone, they held on to the faint but vital hope that should such jaws come too close, they would have the strength and speed to drive them back, buying not just their own next breath, but the precious lives of all who slept behind them. In a world without soap or fine woven garments, where the very air could bite like teeth, early humans discovered curious, almost counterintuitive allies in the fight against cold, mud, and ash. At first glance, smearing oneself with grime might seem like a mark of desperation or filth. But for those living under the raw sky, where each night was a new gamble with frost, these humble substances became secret weapons that helped shield fragile skin from the merciless grasp of winter. The idea likely grew out of simple observation. Hunters crawling through damp earth to stalk prey might notice how their mud-cacked limbs felt oddly insulated, the chill of wind dulled by the crust forming over their skin. Similarly, the remnants of a spent fire, gray-black ash that clung to everything it touched, left a faint layer that seemed to trap warmth just a little longer. Over countless trials, people learned that a coating of mud or soot slowed the greedy pull of cold air, forming a crude barrier that took the edge off the worst of the bite. So before bedding down for the night, some would scoop handfuls of moist earth, working it over arms and legs until it dried into a thin, cracking shell. Others reached into the cooling hearth to gather ash, rubbing it into shoulders and chests. This wasn't done carelessly. Too much moisture in the mud could draw heat away instead of preserving it, and hot embers hidden in ash could sear. It required practiced hands and an instinctive sense of balance, passed down from elder to child like any vital tool. The layer of dirt and soot served more than one purpose. Alongside its slight insulating effect, it also masked the scent of sweat and human skin. This had a twofold benefit. First, it helped to deter the interest of insects that might otherwise swarm exposed bodies, biting and burrowing during the night's still hours. Second, it potentially confused the noses of prowling predators, mingling human musk with the common smells of earth and burned wood. There was a psychological comfort to it, too. To lie down slicked in mud or streaked in charcoal was to wear a kind of crude armor. Underneath these layers, people felt less naked to the world's cruelties, less vulnerable to the cold that slipped like a ghost between hides, less exposed to eyes that might gleam from the shadows. Children sometimes giggled at the ticklish drag of ash on their bellies, while parents made solemn patterns across their own arms and faces, mixing protection with old symbols whose meanings had long blurred into instinct. In the heart of night, these bodies, camouflaged in gray and brown, became part of the earth itself. If you stumbled upon such a group sleeping close under a shallow rock overhang or tucked among dry reeds, you might have mistaken them for lumps of soil or charred logs, only realizing the truth when one stirred and exhaled a cloud of warm breath into the cold air. And in the morning, as frost whitened the grass and painted the world with brittle lace, these people would rise, their makeshift shells cracking away to reveal flesh still flushed with life. They would brush off flakes of dried mud, clap at patches of stubborn soot, and carry on, living proof that even the simplest elements, humble as dirt and ash, could be wielded with quiet genius against the relentless cold of a world that offered them so little mercy. Eventually, the relentless lessons of countless bitter nights taught early humans that warmth wasn't only about what they wrapped around their bodies or laid beneath them. It was also about what stood over them, the space above their heads, where wind, rain, and snow could either flow freely or be held at bay. In this realization was born the earliest spark of architecture, though it was far from the sturdy walls and peaked roofs of later ages. These first shelters were humble, almost timid gestures toward controlling the immense and indifferent world. Imagine a small group wandering the wilds, burdened by the weight of furs, tools, children clinging to shoulders. As dusk settled and the air turned to glassy chill, they would look for more than just an open patch of ground. Eyes scanned for leaning trees, low overhangs of rock, even fallen trunks whose tangled branches formed crude canopies. But when nature failed to provide, they made do with their own hands, weaving the first awkward skeletons of protection out of the raw materials around them. A simple frame might begin with stout branches driven into the earth at slanting angles, tied together with strips of sinew or flexible shoots. Across this, they'd lay lighter boughs, layering them in tight, overlapping patterns like the scales of a great sleeping beast. Dry grasses, leafy limbs, moss torn in heavy clumps from forest stones, all would be stuffed and pressed into the gaps, until at last the structure held enough substance to break the wind. These first shelters weren't built to impress. They leaned crookedly, sagged under the damp weight of morning dew, and sometimes collapsed under heavy snowfall. Yet even so, they transformed nights in profound ways. With a crude roof overhead, precious heat no longer drifted straight up into the starry void. The small space beneath, dense with the exhalations of sleeping bodies, grew palpably warmer, turning into a fragile cocoon of breath and life that staved off the worst of the frost. This also freed people from piling all their hopes on skins alone. Instead of laying hides flat on bare earth where they soaked up moisture and filth, they could be draped along the sides of these shelters, thickening walls and forming inner pockets where air warmed quickly. Some groups even learned to stretch hides across the very top, creating a more reliable shield against sudden drizzles or snow flurries that might otherwise soak bedding and make the cold twice as cruel. In the dim light of evening, you might have seen families bustling about these primitive huts, plugging holes with clumps of moss, patting down tufts of grass, testing the sway of branches. Children often helped, if only by carrying armfuls of green things or tugging playfully at dangling leaves, their laughter chasing away for a moment the ever-present shadow of the cold. When the work was done, the small tribe would slip inside, arranging themselves atop their layered bedding, moss, warm stones, hides, all beneath this frail canopy that still somehow felt like a fortress. Even the sound changed inside. Outside, the night was a choir of restless winds, the crack of distant branches, the subtle pad of creatures moving unseen. But within these shelters, noise dampened, grew muffled, like breath beneath a heavy blanket. Fires built at the entrances sometimes smoldered low, sending thin curls of smoke to swirl beneath the peaked roof and slip through loose seams, carrying with it the sharp tang of char that clung to hair and skin. Such shelters were not perfect. In storms, they might leak or even collapse, sending families scurrying out into the open to rebuild or find sturdier refuge. Yet with each season, their builders learned better tricks: how to brace the walls against sudden gusts, which angles shed rain best, which plants packed most tightly to block the cutting breath of winter. In this way, these first humble structures, crooked, fragrant with green sap and earth, stood as testaments to human determination. They were the first fragile outlines of home, places where the long dark of night was kept just a little farther away, and where families could sleep under a roof of their own, no longer utterly exposed to the mercy of a vast, uncaring sky. In this way, these first humble structures, crooked, fragrant with green sap and earth, stood as testaments to human determination. They were the first fragile outlines of home, places where the long dark of night was kept just a little farther away, and where families could sleep under a roof of their own making, no longer utterly exposed to the mercy of a vast, uncaring sky. If someone from our clean, bright world were suddenly dropped into the sleeping place of early humans, their first reaction would almost certainly be shock, not at the sights, but at the smells. The air inside those cramped shelters was thick with layers of scent so deep they seemed to cling to the very walls. Damp animal hides drying after days of exposure to snow and rain. Wood smoke wound into every fiber of fur and moss. The sharp, slightly sour tang of sweat from bodies that had worked and hunted all day. The rich, musky undertone of earth itself, stirred up and pressed close by countless feet and hands. To us, it might seem almost unbearable. We're used to linens scrubbed with soap, rooms deodorized by sprays and electric filters, a whole culture that treats any strong natural odor as an enemy to be scrubbed away. But for those early people, this mingling of smells wasn't just tolerable, it was deeply reassuring. It was the perfume of life itself, each layer telling a quiet story of survival. There was the smoky scent of ash that coated hair and skin, a byproduct of countless fires tended through long nights. It sank into pores, settled under fingernails, clung stubbornly to woven cords and leather thongs. Far from being unpleasant, it acted like a protective badge, a scent that masked the raw human smell from prowling predators, and even helped keep biting insects at bay. Mixed into that was the wild, oily aroma of animal skins. Freshly stripped, they carried the ghost of the creature's own musk, an echo of blood and grass and the open air of the hunt. As they aged, these hides took on deeper, smokier notes from countless nights near fires, slowly curing with each cycle of warmth and chill. For the people who curled beneath them, these odors meant shelter, meant a buffer against the bitter grasp of winter. Pressing their faces into a pile of furs was like breathing in a promise. Here is where we stay warm. Here is where we make it to another sunrise. The human smells, sweat, breath, the subtle tang that rose from skin pressed close through hours of sleep, were perhaps the most powerful of all. These were the scents of kin. A child drifting off with a nose buried against a parent's neck inhaled the bouquet of familiarity that quieted fear and anchored dreams. Even disagreements from the daylight hours softened under the intimate mingling of breath and warmth. Each inhalation reminded them who lay beside them, who would stand up for them if danger crept in before morning. And beneath it all, the primal smell of earth. Damp moss used as bedding, clumps of dirt tracked in on bare feet, stones warmed by buried coals. It was a scent that said, "This is our place," blending human life back into the soil from which it had always come. To outsiders, even to us now standing at so great a distance in time, it might read as filth or discomfort. But to those who lived by these scents, it was the aroma of safety. If the shelters smelled of smoke and hides and close living bodies, it meant the walls still stood, the fire still burned, and no predator had yet breached their fragile defenses. In many ways, these odors were the very first lullaby, wrapping each sleeper in a cocoon of familiarity that whispered of belonging, of warmth, of the simple triumph of enduring together through one more night. There was an unspoken understanding woven into the nightly preparations of these early people, a wisdom that didn't come from carved symbols or long-told legends, but from the simple, instinctive ache to protect what mattered most. As the fires dwindled and bodies arranged themselves atop beds of moss, warm stones, and layered hides, there was always careful attention paid to who lay where. The youngest and the oldest, those most fragile against the creeping cold, were gently guided, even tugged toward the very heart of the human cluster. There was tender strategy to this. The outer ring bore the first brush of cold air. the first searching drafts that slipped under the roof of woven branches or through gaps in stone. It was the place where a hand might stay loosely on a spear or a stone knife, ready should the darkness rustle with danger. By taking these spots, the capable ensured that the vulnerable in the center could drift into deeper sleep, untroubled by fears that might otherwise clutch their dreams. For children, this was simply the shape of the world, a nest of warmth, always breathing around them, always safe. They would burrow deeper without thinking, nestling small faces into the hollow of a mother's shoulder or a grandfather's broad back. Tiny feet kicked out now and then, only to be gently gathered in by an adult hand, guiding them back into the curve of the communal embrace. For the elders, these nights offered bittersweet comfort. Many had spent long seasons on the outer edges themselves, gripping spears with eyes sharp to every stirring of shadow. Now, wrapped on all sides by children, sons, daughters, nieces, and nephews, they rested in a warmth they had once given. Their breath came slower, bodies less reliable in the fight against chill, but they lay knowing they were cradled by generations who owed them their own strong hearts and calloused hands. This arrangement did more than protect bodies from cold. It reinforced bonds in ways words could never reach. Each night was a silent reaffirmation that the life of the group mattered more than the convenience or comfort of any single person. By cradling the weakest at the core, they declared without speech that a family, a clan, a tribe was only as strong as the protection it offered its most defenseless. And so the heap of humanity would settle at last. Soft whimpers from children quieted into steady, moist breathing. Elders drifted off, dreams a tangle of memory and faint pain. Around them, adults held the line, shoulders pressed tight, arms slung across each other, skin prickling now and then at gusts that rattled the crude walls. Above, the night stretched on, vast and cold and utterly indifferent. But inside that tight knot of bodies, warmth pulsed and grew, fed by countless small hearts beating together, whispering through their very heat that here, in this humble nest, life still insisted on enduring. The cold was always there, stalking, pressing, breathing against the edges of every camp, but it became something far crueler when paired with hunger. A person could survive the wind with enough hides, endure the frost with a warm fire and a pile of bodies around them. But when the belly was empty, when the fire inside the body had gone dim from lack of food, even the thickest furs felt like little more than a dream. A hungry night wasn't just uncomfortable, it was terrifying. Elders, too, were at risk. Their stores of strength had already been drawn thin from age. When food was short, they gave it to the young first, to the hunters who needed it most. They'd lie down with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, murmuring reassurances that tomorrow would be better, even as the frost coiled itself around their legs. On these nights, rituals deepened. People sang softly, not for joy, but to keep spirits high enough to last until morning. Stories were whispered, even if no one was listening, just to fill the darkness with something other than fear. And sometimes, when someone had hidden a scrap of food in a pouch or a pocket, they shared it without a word, pressing it into another's hand under the hides, like a blessing. Because they all knew a hungry night wasn't just about surviving the dark. It was a test of how well they could protect each other when the fire inside each body had almost gone out. When warmth couldn't come from within, it had to come from togetherness, from the press of skin, the shared breath, the quiet promise that no one would be left alone. And when dawn finally came, spilling pale light over the smoke-blackened stones and the tangled pile of sleeping bodies, those who stirred and found their limbs still warm, their lungs still moving, carried with them not just relief, but gratitude. Because on that night, when hunger and cold had come hand in hand, they had endured. And in that endurance was the seed of something stronger than survival, the bond that only those who had faced the worst together could truly understand. Warmth was not the only comfort people sought when they laid down for the long, uncertain hours of night. For early humans, the dark was not just a time of cold. It was a vast, echoing void full of mysteries and unseen dangers. To slip into sleep was to wander helpless through that void, leaving the body still and vulnerable, while the mind drifted off into realms as shadowy as the forests beyond their fires. So alongside hides and furs, they brought other small treasures into their nests, objects that, in their humble way, promised protection, luck, or simply a fragile sense of peace. Among the most curious of these were little figures carved from wood, bone, or even lumps of hardened earth. Shaped by rough hands using flakes of stone, these idols often bore only the simplest hints of eyes, mouths, limbs. Yet to those who made them, they were far more than toys or mere decoration. They were companions against the dark, tiny watchers who might keep harmful spirits at bay while their owners slept. A child might tuck one under an arm, pressing its familiar shape close, or a grown hunter might keep one nestled at his throat beneath layers of hide, where its presence was a steady, hidden reassurance. Others favored small amulets, beads strung on sinew, teeth taken from slain beasts, smoothed stones with strange marks that seemed to carry a story no one could quite remember. These might be tied around wrists, ankles, or necks before sleep. Some people lay them under their heads, believing that dreams could flow through the objects and come out gentler, less haunted by sharp-toothed visions. Then there was the scent of resin. Clumps of sticky tree sap were prized not only for feeding fires or sealing cracks in shelters, but for their sweet, pungent aroma. People would sometimes smear bits of this resin on their hands or skins, or keep small lumps wrapped in leaves tucked beside them at night. The smell cut through the rank closeness of smoke and sweat, offered a hint of forest even in the cramped heart of a crowded sleeping nest. It was, in its own way, a comfort, a reminder of green life waiting beyond winter's clutch. Certain stones, too, earned special favor. Not every rock was alike in the eyes of those early people. Some were smooth to the touch, fitting perfectly in a curled palm. Others flecked with colors that caught firelight in strange glimmers. These became personal talismans, kept close by night just as by day. Some believed such stones could absorb fear or confuse spirits that tried to find them while they lay defenseless in dreams. A person might drift off with one clasped in a fist, the rough edges digging lightly into skin, a tactile tether to the waking world. All of these, the little idols, the necklaces strung with bone, the fragrant smears of resin, the cool press of a lucky stone, wove themselves into the nightly rituals of sleep. They made the darkness more bearable, turned the silent hours into something shared with these small, powerful objects. Each had a story, a history tied to hunts survived, loved ones remembered, old terrors driven off by morning light. So the ancient beds were more than piles of hides and moss. They were tiny sanctuaries, personal spaces crowded with hopes and whispered protections. As breath slowed and the hush of sleep settled over the shelter, these tokens lay scattered among limbs and furs, quiet sentinels holding vigil until dawn. In the fragile world of those early people, it was not enough to chase away the cold with mere fire. The heart needed guarding too, and sometimes all it took was the feel of a small carving under the chin, or the scent of pine clinging to a hand, to carry a soul safely through the treacherous lands of the night. As night settled thick around the camp, the small flames at the heart of each shelter or cave took on a strange new life. During the day, fire was practical. It cooked meat, hardened spear tips, dried soaked hides. But in the deep hours, when the world shrank to the tight circle of bodies and embers, its glow became something altogether different. It painted the walls in restless shapes, throwing long, twisting shadows that danced and bowed in ways no living creature ever did. Children lay wide-eyed on moss and furs, their faces half buried against a parent's side, watching those dark figures writhe across stone. Sometimes a flicker would make a shadow grow enormous, looming over them like a silent giant, before collapsing into nothing with the next shift of flame. Even adults, who knew well enough that it was only firelight playing tricks, could not help the small prickle at the base of the neck, that deep old instinct that warned, "Watch, watch, something moves." It was inevitable that stories grew out of these restless silhouettes. Someone might clear their throat, or tap a rhythmic hand against a knee, drawing the attention of the others. Then, in a low voice, they'd begin to spin a tale, half warning, half entertainment, about what those shapes really were. Perhaps they were spirits of the beasts hunted that day, come to see if the tribe wasted their gift. Or maybe they were older things, beings who lived in the cracks of the rocks and only showed themselves when the world was too quiet to notice. The stories did double duty. They explained the eerie dance of light in ways that felt just plausible enough to soothe the mind, while also feeding the thrill of fear that every human heart seems to secretly crave. A child might tremble, hiding under a hide, but would peek out anyway, unable to resist watching the wall to see if the story's ghost or forest demon would truly appear. Adults weren't immune to this spell either. Around the fire, faces glowed with ruddy light, eyes reflecting sparks like tiny flames of their own. Each new tale layered a bit more meaning onto the shadows, turning them into tricksters, guardians, or silent omens of things to come. They found comfort in these explanations, however unsettling. It was less frightening to believe the unknown shapes belonged to something that could be named, even if it was dangerous, than to admit they were simply the vast, indifferent dark pressing in from all sides. Now and then, someone would reach out, letting their hand block the firelight for a moment, creating its own puppet on the stone. A crude bird, a leaping wolf, a man with long arms and stretched legs. Laughter might follow, a nervous release of tension. Even as hearts raced, these small performances reminded everyone they had some power here. They could shape the darkness, give it stories, make it theirs. And so the night was filled not just with breath and the soft rustle of shifting bodies, but with whispers of cautionary tales and hopeful myths. The shadows on the walls became a shared language, telling of dangers conquered and mysteries still lurking. By wrapping the unknown in stories, they tamed it just enough to drift toward sleep, because somehow even the most chilling tale was less frightening than the raw silence of the cave without it, the silence that would leave them alone with only the hungry, watchful dark. Morning didn't so much break over these early camps as seep into them, a slow lifting of gloom that gradually painted the world in muted grays and finally hesitant gold. Long before the sun crested fully into view, pale light would begin to pool at the cave mouth or slip through the ragged weave of branches overhead, nudging the tight huddle of sleepers toward wakefulness. And with that light came the scents, not fresh or sharp like morning dew on untouched grass, but a thick, lived-in aroma that was the very signature of human survival. The air inside the shelter was heavy with the accumulated breath of many bodies, slightly sour and warm. Furs and hides gave off their own pungent musk, a cocktail of old animal oil, lingering smoke, and the damp of condensed nighttime sweat. Moss bedding, compressed under so much weight, released a loamy, slightly moldy scent each time someone shifted. When people began to stir, it wasn't with bright chatter or brisk movements. It was a slow, communal unfurling. A hunter might grunt softly as he rolled stiff shoulders, easing sore muscles that had spent hours locked in tight embrace against the cold. A child would whimper in half-sleep, clinging instinctively to the nearest warm side, even as the press of bodies around them loosened. An elder, blinking against the pale light, would cough lightly, sending up a faint puff of breath that still clouded in the chill. The smoky residue of last night's fire clung to everything. It filled hair with a sharp tang, lay across skin in thin, invisible grime. Fingers drawn through beards or tangled locks came away with a faint gray dusting. Yet to these people it was a familiar comfort, the perfume of safety that had carried them through another perilous stretch of darkness. Some mornings the condensation was heavy. Tiny droplets beaded on the inside of shelters where breath had risen and cooled against colder surfaces. Those drops would trickle down to darken hides or splash lightly onto cheeks and foreheads, startling people awake with their sudden chill. Beneath sleeping nests, where warm bodies had pressed against moss and dirt all night, small pockets of steam rose when the fresh morning air slipped in. It was like the camp itself exhaled, releasing the night's tension in slow, fragrant sighs. The combined scent of it all, the smoky hair, the slightly sour sweat, the damp earth, the faint resin from last night's small fires, was not unpleasant to them. It was the smell of survival, a reminder that every person who roused themselves from these beds had successfully passed through yet another trial by cold and dark. It was the scent of bodies still breathing, of hearts still beating close to one another. As people began to pull themselves upright, skins sliding from shoulders and pooled warmth leaking out into the morning air, there was often a moment of quiet. They sat, blinking, nostrils flaring at the rich, dense scent of their little world. It grounded them, a visceral proof that the night, for all its dangers and hidden claws, had not claimed anyone this time. And then slowly, inevitably, the camp would rouse in earnest. Soft voices broke the hush. A child's laugh pealed out. The first low crack of a joint being stretched, or a hide being shaken. Smoke began to curl anew from rekindled embers. The smells of morning, of new fires, of hands rubbing down stiff limbs, of cautious hope that perhaps this day would be kinder, started to layer themselves over the remnants of the night. In that mingling, life pressed forward once more, humble and persistent, ready to meet whatever waited beyond the fragile perimeter of the camp. Not every night ended with the gentle rustle of waking bodies and the slow, smoky stretch into dawn. Sometimes the dark proved just as treacherous as everyone feared, and the fragile sanctuaries of hides, moss, and huddled warmth became cruel traps the moment danger struck. It often started with nothing more than a shift in the air, a faint crunch of leaves outside the perimeter, a brief catch of breath among those still half asleep. At first, it was easy to dismiss as the night's constant chorus of settling wood and whispering wind. But then came a sharper noise, claws scrabbling on stone, the low, rumbling huff of something large testing the air, nostrils flaring for the scent of flesh and blood. When predators ventured close, lean wolves driven by hunger past caution, or solitary cats that moved like whispers on muscle and bone, the darkness inside the camp seemed to grow colder, as though it braced for the violence it already knew was coming. If a guard was awake, he might start with a hissed warning, not daring to shout. Sleep-drugged bodies snapped upright, hands reaching for spears, knuckles white around stone blades. In these moments, the comfortable heap of humanity turned suddenly clumsy, arms tangled in hides, feet kicking blindly at moss and packed earth. The very closeness that had kept them alive through the cold became a dangerous knot as people tried to pull free and ready themselves for whatever lunged from the black. Sometimes the intruder was content to circle, to watch with those patient, gleaming eyes, hoping a careless child would stray too far from the cluster. But hunger is a powerful master. When it finally drove them to charge, it was terrifyingly swift. A blur of fur, claws striking stone, a flash of teeth bared in a snarl that shattered the thin membrane of human night. Men thrust spears forward, sometimes missing in the frenzy, striking earth or one another. Women dragged children back, pressing small faces into the crook of an elbow so they would not see. Fires that had burned low were shoved back to life with frantic handfuls of moss and sticks, sending up sudden showers of sparks meant to drive the beast back with heat and light. The camp filled with the hot, iron scent of sweat, fear, and sometimes blood, whether from an unlucky cut or a slashing paw that found flesh before it was driven off. These terrifying visits changed how they slept. Camps began to place fires in deliberate rings, not just one hearth at the center, but several smaller ones scattered around the edges, so any eyes watching from the dark would find fewer shadows to hide in. Spears were laid across laps even while drifting into uneasy slumber. Those who had been closest to harm learned to rest half upright, heads jerking up at the slightest crunch outside the walls of branches or stone. Children who once sprawled in careless comfort were now tucked deeper into the center, layers of adults forming living ramparts around them. And in the mornings after such nights, the hush that followed waking was heavier, the smells of sweat and smoke more pungent, with the sharp tang of fear newly confirmed. Yet somehow, after checking tracks outside the camp and reassuring one another with small touches or murmured grunts, they would rebuild. Hides were tightened, fires relit, spears checked for cracks. Because in the end, even the surest horror of the night could not stop the slow, stubborn force of life that pushed these people to keep lying down together, to risk sleep again, to trust once more in their closeness, their only true defense against a world forever hungry for their warmth. Long before anyone etched stories into stone or tied meanings into woven patterns, humans carried in their minds a quiet dread of what happened when sleep took hold. They saw it each night. A person would lie down, eyes closing, breath slowing, body slackening, until it was almost unrecognizable from lifelessness. And they saw too that in dreams, people traveled, faces twisted with fear, arms flung out to ward off invisible threats, lips moving in speech that no one else could hear. It was only natural that such mysteries would breed a sense that something essential, something like a breath beyond breath, slipped free when sleep arrived. Many early groups believed the soul itself wandered during these hours, drifting into the world of shadows just as surely as hunters stepped into foreign woods. And just like any hunter, the soul could get lost, ensnared, even stolen by things that lurked beyond the small circle of firelight. So around their beds of moss and ash, before settling down for the night, people practiced small rites meant to anchor that hidden part of themselves. A person might tie a thin strip of leather or a plaited cord loosely around a wrist or ankle, a symbolic tether to the body, so the soul would remember the way back. Others traced rough patterns in ash across their foreheads or over their hearts, signs learned from elders, said to confuse spirits that might try to beckon them away in sleep. Parents watched their children especially closely at these hours. A mother might murmur rhythmic phrases while stroking a child's cheek, words passed down by generations that didn't fully remember why, only that they worked. Fathers would sometimes lay a protective hand over a small rib cage, feeling the steady rise and fall, assuring themselves that whatever wandered during dreams still knew how to return. Certain camps refused to let fires die completely. Even if fuel was scarce, a few coals were kept alive, carefully banked under stones, so that some living heart of warmth and light remained through the night. It wasn't only for physical comfort. Many believed a darkened camp invited wandering spirits to mistake sleeping souls for their own and lead them astray into the world beyond breath. There were also softer customs. Lovers or close companions might sleep with foreheads pressed together, breath mingling, as if to share a single, stronger tether to the realm of the living. Elders would sometimes murmur stories, not for entertainment, but as gentle reminders to any listening spirits that this soul, this body, was claimed, rooted, surrounded by kin who would call it back. And if someone woke abruptly in the night, gasping from a dream that left them shaking, those nearby often responded without question. A hand reached out, a low, soothing sound hummed close to the ear. They understood instinctively that the person's spirit might be struggling to find its way home, disoriented by whatever realms it had stumbled through. These small reassurances, touch, breath, shared warmth, were thought to guide it safely back into the waiting vessel of flesh. So the sleeping place became more than just a fortress against the cold. It was a nest of invisible threads, each ritual a way to stitch souls to bodies, to keep the night from claiming more than its fair share. Under the rustling hides and faint scent of smoke, people lay close, eyes fluttering beneath their lids, carried on currents of dream. And through these cautious, tender acts, they hoped that when morning returned, each spirit would once more settle fully into its rightful shell, alive, breathing, and ready to rise again with the sun. As the night settled thick around them, and bodies found their resting places in the tangled press of hides and moss, voices rarely fell completely silent. Even after the last sparks of laughter or the final muttered story about shadows on the wall, there lingered a softer current of sound, low whispers, hushed exchanges that passed like small secret rivers through the camp. The darkness seemed to draw these confidences out. In the bright, busy hours of day, people's minds were filled with practical things: the hunt, the scraping of hides, the watch for distant smoke that might signal strangers. But when the world shrank to the small, warm nest of bodies, when the only light was the faint glow of smoldering coals or the slow blinking of stars beyond the shelter's mouth. It was as if hearts could finally lift their burdens in quiet company. Lovers spoke then, voices barely above breath, trading hopes or gentle teases in tones no one else could quite catch. A hand might slip over a shoulder, fingers curling into familiar grooves as they whispered plans about tomorrow's foraging or small memories of laughter shared under greener leaves. Sometimes they spoke of fears, too, of what would happen if the game never returned, or if the next storm tore their fragile roofs apart. It was easier to admit these tremors in the hush of night, when faces were close and the darkness forgave the sting of vulnerability. Parents murmured soft instructions or calming stories to restless children. A father might recount how he once bested a wolf with only a burning branch, making the child clutch him tighter, not just from fear, but from the comfort of believing in such protection. Mothers hummed half-forgotten lullabies, their tunes meandering like drifting smoke until small eyes fluttered shut, even as little hands still gripped theirs. But it wasn't only intimate cares. Friends lay side by side, shoulders pressed close, trading fragments of thought too tender or private for daylight. They might share half-formed dreams of places beyond the hills, or recall the face of someone lost seasons ago, finding solace in the act of remembering together. The night made them philosophers, poets of a kind, pondering the strange shapes in the stars, the way dreams could ripple through the mind like fish darting under ice. There was a particular honesty that bloomed in these moments. By day, pride stood guard. No one wanted to seem too frightened, too unsure, too full of longing for things they could not have. But in the dark, with breath warm against another's neck and the shelter cocooning them in a fragile peace, it felt almost safe to let those softer truths slip free. Worries about the thinness of the food stores, confessions of nightmares that refused to fade, quiet awe at how the sky looked when the fire finally went out. All of it found a place in the hush. And when words faltered, there was still the comfort of presence. A shiver answered by an arm pulled tighter, a sigh that drew an echoing sigh in return. The simple knowledge that they were not alone, that hearts beat all around them, staving off the immense silence of the world. So night after night, the camp pulsed with these low, weaving conversations. By the time sleep finally closed in fully, those whispered exchanges had done more than fill the darkness. They had bound the people to each other in ways no spear or wall ever could. It was a fragile, tender magic, born of shared breath and secret words, that made facing another day's perils not just possible, but deeply, undeniably worthwhile. It was there, in the cramped press of bodies under hides, in the smoky closeness of nighttime shelters, that something profound began to take shape, something more enduring than any shelter of wood or stone. As these early humans curled together against the cold, with children tucked between parents, with old ones cushioned by the strong backs of hunters and foragers, the first fragile outlines of what we would come to call family emerged. By necessity, they learned to rely on each other not just for the day's hunt or the construction of traps, but for survival through the long, treacherous hours when the world turned dark and teeth gleamed beyond the circle of light. Lying so close they could feel each other's hearts through layers of skin and fur, hearing the soft hiccup of a sleeping child or the wheezy breaths of an elder, they became more than just bands bound by common need. They became living nets that caught and held every member within. Night after night, these shared beds of moss and hides forged bonds stronger than any spoken promise. A child who awoke trembling from a nightmare would find not just a mother's hand, but half a dozen others nearby, an aunt's, a cousin's, even the calloused fingers of the hunter who hours before had seemed so remote and stern. An old man who winced with the pains of age found his joints soothed by the heat of young bodies pressed on either side, their breath mingling with his in the damp warmth beneath the hides. These moments didn't just ward off the cold, they seeded trust. They built a quiet web of loyalty and tenderness. In the hush that followed a whispered tale or the final drowsy joke before sleep, there settled a collective recognition. You are my people, and I am yours. The cold made sure of it. Without each other, they were nothing more than meat waiting to stiffen in the frost. Together, they were a breathing, shifting fortress of heat and vigilance, hope and memory. In these long nights, stories were not only told, but lived. A woman might share the last scrap of dried meat with a child not her own. A man might wake at a faint sound and tighten an arm around someone who, by blood, was little more than a distant cousin, yet who in that moment was as dear as a sibling. The needs of survival blurred strict lines of kinship, turning small bands into something richer, messier, far more binding. And as seasons turned, these sleeping clusters hardened into custom. The same bodies that pressed together night after night grew to expect one another's warmth, their hearts shaped by countless hours spent breathing the same thick, smoky air. Bonds formed in the dark carried over into daylight. Hunts were planned not just by strength, but by who had guarded whom through the cold. Food was shared more freely among those who had slept side by side. Children grew up believing instinctively that protection and affection stretched well beyond the mother's arms to the whole close-pressed crowd that had cradled them through 1,000 icy nights. Thus, what started as a simple strategy to beat back the cold evolved into the first true architecture of human connection. Family was no longer just about who had given birth to whom. It was defined by whose breath had kept you alive under the hides, who had soothed your shivers with a palm against your back, who had murmured soft promises in the dark that tomorrow would still come. Out of the raw necessity of surviving together was born something astonishingly tender and tenacious. The first families, woven not just by blood, but by countless nights of shared fear, shared warmth, and the quiet triumph of waking together to see another dawn. And so at last, after the fires had burned low and the quiet had settled over every nest of moss and hide, there came that deep, hushed pause where even fear seemed to drift off. In this pause, some would open their eyes, peering out from beneath heavy firs or through gaps in woven branches to stare up at the vastness that stretched overhead, the boundless, ink-dark sweep of sky pricked through with uncountable stars. It was the same sky we look upon today, the same constellations that now hang over cities and fields once wheeled over their raw shelters and sleeping circles. The same fragile dusting of light that we marvel at from porches or dark country roads was their ceiling too, silent witness to their struggles and whispered dreams. Lying there, shoulder pressed to shoulder, breath slowing in shared rhythm, they would watch those distant fires flicker. Maybe they wondered, as we still do, what lay beyond them. Perhaps they made quiet stories to explain how the brightest points were ancestors watching, or spirits keeping vigil so that no harm might slip unseen through the veil of night. In those moments, the fear of predators, the ache of empty bellies, the sharp edge of cold all seemed to soften. Under that immense canopy, surrounded by the steady warmth of bodies that had become so much more than mere survival partners, people could feel something almost sacred. Each heartbeat was an answer to the dark, each soft exhale a promise that they were still here. Fragile, yes, but together. Children curled tighter against the comfort of a mother's side or a father's broad back, eyelids fluttering as they gave in to sleep. Elders blinked slow, thoughtful blinks, perhaps recalling other nights under these same stars, when they had lain as the young did now, faces upturned, wondering how many dawns still waited for them. Lovers let hands drift lazily over each other's ribs or shoulders, tracing idle patterns that were more about closeness than words. And above them all, the universe stretched on, vast and unchanged by the tiny dramas below. The stars didn't care who was hungry or who had told the best story by the fire. But for the people beneath them, that starry expanse offered something essential, a sense of continuity, of enduring beyond the brief span of one life or even a single tribe. It hinted that while winter might steal warmth, while beasts might threaten at the edges, there was a larger rhythm that went on forever. So they lay there under that ageless tapestry, bound to one another by breath, by memory, by countless nights of mutual protection and whispered hope. And in doing so, they wove themselves into a story that reaches all the way to us, a story of humans pressing close against the cold, lifting their eyes to the same brilliant sky, hearts full of quiet wonder, and the fragile, stubborn will to see yet another morning.